Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Peter Galdies and I'm founder and director of DQM GRC. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be another interesting and lively discussion. I'd like to get started with a little bit of housekeeping. The agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We're going to spend 10 minutes just introducing the topic, introducing ourselves, and then we're going to run into the main discussion. And we've got a few questions to talk through together. We're going to ask you some polls as we go through the sessions this afternoon, and then we're going to finish with questions from the audience. But if possible, I'd like you to be putting your questions as we go through. Should be a panel on your right-hand side, probably, of your screen where you can add questions. Please feel free to put them whenever you like on there. Also, when we do the polls, there's a section within there where you'll be able to answer the poll and see the results. Okay, so let's get cracking. So let's just start with a little bit about GRC International. We're a leading global provider of IT governance, risk management and privacy compliance solutions. We have a comprehensive range of products and services which provide a uniquely integrated alternative to traditional consultancy firms, publishing houses, penetration testers and training providers. Of particular importance and relevance for today's webinar are our cybersecurity services from IT governance, data protection practice from DQM GRC, and our legal support from GRCI Law. Together, they provide what we believe is a uniquely combined service for organisations of all shapes and sizes. Right now, with COVID-19, protect, comply, thrive approach aimed at helping organisations achieve resilience in the face of constant change has never seemed more appropriate. And that brings me nicely to today's topic. Without doubt, COVID-19 has been dramatic for the vast majority of our organisation. The sudden shift we've all experienced in our working patterns has brought with it huge changes to social and working habits. And as a consequence, new cyber risks and data privacy challenges have arrived, which affect the way organisations need to operate. Many, if not most organisations, now have substantial numbers of employees working from home, and these employees may be accessing and processing information outside of our normal security perimeters. And this, of course, increases the risk of a data breach. And now, with the government's introduction of the 5-phase recovery plan and the back to work for those who can message, means that we need to be considering what cyber and privacy risks we should plan for as our employees return to the workplace, and in some cases, stay working from home for the longer term. Many forecasters think it's likely that further COVID-19 outbreaks, perhaps regional, perhaps national, will occur. So it's also important to consider what we've learned during this lockdown period and what we might do differently as and when further lockdown periods are applied. So yet more change gives us plenty to consider and to discuss. So I'm very happy to welcome back our panel of cybersecurity, legal and privacy experts, Geraint, Camilla and John. And I just wonder if you could spend a few minutes each giving yourselves an introduction. That would be brilliant. Starting with Geraint.
All right, so I'm the CISO for the GRC International Group, with all the responsibilities and issues that brings with it. But prior to being the CISO for the group, I was the Technical Services Manager for IT governance, responsibility for penetration testing, PCI, and also for cyber essentials, along with other technical consultancy. My background has been very much on the technical side. I've worked with universities, delivering computer forensics and digital ethical hacking courses, and delivering material around that, as well as being the trainer around the sort of the CISP program. But my strength is the technical controls.
Thank you. And Camilla.
Hi, I'm Camilla Winlow. I'm Director of Consultancy Services for DQM GRC. We are a privacy consultancy practice, but we specialise in helping organisations to implement privacy in a way that improves everything. So we work with a wide range of companies, from small startups all the way to multinational organisations, helping them to understand where the gold is in privacy regulations and how that can really help them with operations, with risk management, with everything that organisations do, how you can help make it better. And my background is actually launching businesses in response to regulatory change. So what I really like is finding that gold inside the regulations and the way that it can help make businesses better.
Fantastic. And John?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Potts, and I'm the head of DPO, DSART and Breach Support Services at GRCI Law. And the role of GRCI Law within the group is that we provide DPO services, a full DPO service, again, from small startups to major companies and organisations. We provide the complete package of your in-house DPO outsourced at a far better rate. Prior to joining GRCI Law, I was head of information law and security at the Metropolitan Police, where I headed up the subject access teams, the entire information rights unit. My strengths and what I bring to this particular webinar panel discussion are around subject access request and data breaches. The Met used to get the odd subject access request, about 5,500 a year when I left, and we have the odd data breach as well. So that's the strength that I bring.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's get into the bulk of our discussion. And as I said before, I think we're going to start with a poll. I'm just going to launch the poll now. And these will help us put our discussions into context, I think. And if we could spend perhaps the next 30 seconds, everybody feel free to contribute and register your answer, and then we'll have a quick look and see where we are. Okay, so I think I'll just give it a few more seconds and then I'll close this particular poll and we can have a look and see how people feel about their concerns for easing lockdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and closing. There we go. So hope you can see the results in the right-hand side of the screen. Thank you, Mihaela. We have 44%, it seems to be a clear majority, for whom the biggest concern is making sure that people feel safe when coming back to work. I think that's a very good response, but actually, a broad range of other concerns as well. 19% making sure the business survives, 14% increasing risks of breaches and incidents, and the other two down at 11%, understanding what we're expecting to do and making sure we stay compliant. So with that in mind, I think we'll open up now the first question to our panel, which is quite simply, what cybersecurity and privacy risks should be considered as lockdown eases? And I think we'll start this question with John. So John, if you could address that for us.
Thank you. I think what we have to understand is that we're in a whole different place at the moment. and we're moving back to somewhere where we are now, where people have been locked down, they've been working from home, they've not been within that protective bubble that the office gives, that protective environment of the office. The ICO's priorities have not changed in that time. They may have put a bit of leniency on things and what have you, but the point that I would make is that we need to make sure that what we've done now, what you've done in lockdown, is actually workable when you get back in the office, and perhaps even more so, that the policies, things that you implement now, whether you've got your home working policies, your security policies, all of those which were taken perhaps on the hoof in face of the virus. It hit us hard and it hit us quick, and the lockdown came on top. So we moved people to working from home, and people understand that. The ICO understands that. What I'm saying is that when we get back, when the lockdown starts to ease, when we get back into the office, we've got to make sure that the policies and everything that we put in place then are defendable. We discussed on at the last panel discussion, we talked about how DPIAs, Freedom of Information Act requests, if you're in that arena, but we'll concentrate on DSARs. We'll concentrate on that area. DSARs that you get now are probably going to be different to the ones that you're going to get once the lockdown eases, because the risk that you've got there is that you've had people furloughed perhaps. You may even be doing redundancies as a result of that. So the policies that you put in place now have got to be defendable when those DSARs, when they come in. The breaches that you have now, we're seeing more and more breaches, the simple ones that always catch people out. And if we're bringing our own devices to work and we're allowing people to do that, then things like CCing, use of BCC or autofill. I've dealt with a case only this week where bring your own device where someone's been using their own computer, use the autofill and sent it to every one of their family members, sent personal information to every one of their family members. So it's about making sure that the policies and everything that you've put in place now are workable when you get back to the office, but they're also protectable. There's no reason why you shouldn't be doing DPIAs now, because you're going to have to defend the reason later on when you get back into the office.
Brilliant. And Garrett, from a security perspective, what are the risks we should really be looking at when people move back to the office? Gavin, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, that's it.
Wouldn't be a webinar.
I think I'm back. So one of the things that's happened so far, there's been a very big increase. There's a significant volume of attacks that are actually using COVID-19 as a lure to actually get people to sort of click on, do something, respond to something. And those attacks, which are sort of, we've seen sort of 30% increase in impersonations, in spam, etc. That's going to continue. As there's sort of confusion around return to work, as there's sort of discussion about what that actually means, it gives an opportunity for the attackers to use those that confusion in lures to actually try and get people to click. So we're going to have the continued social engineering, phishing attacks continue on with sort of business email compromise, impersonation of people going forward. So that's not going to change, that's going to continue. But we also got to actually look at what the effect on the sort of physical security is when we actually go back to the office as well. There are guidelines around about social distancing in the office, etc., and about surfaces in terms of surfaces with touch being cleaned. So with door controls, with the actual sort of pin pads, etc., they're going to need regular cleaning because they've been touched by multiple people. people, there may be a temptation for people to leave doors open into secure areas that they wouldn't normally leave open, just so that they don't have to have people touching the same surface. So there is going to be the security aspect of the physical security aspect of actually returning back to the office while trying to make sure people social distance and actually don't you keep surfaces free from contamination. And you also got to make sure that you actually, whilst social distancing is, if companies have actually been using lots of paper records, they may want to actually transfer some of those to electronically to make it easier to pass around the office rather than passing paper copies around. That's actually got to be understood and the controls put in place if that's not something you're actually used to actually doing. So it's a process of actually monitoring all the sort of well, keeping awareness up, but also making sure that all the controls you have to put in place to make your business sort of COVID-19 safe, you're not actually introducing new threats and vulnerabilities that you've not actually thought about previously.
Okay. And Camilla, from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, so the biggest thing you're going to have to do is you're going to need to understand what coming back into the office actually looks like for your employees. And that's likely to involve you needing to collect new data. So what the government's done is that they've divided people into groups. So we talk about clinically extremely vulnerable individuals. Those guys need to stay at home. It's potentially not just your employees who might fall into that category. They may need to shield at home because somebody in their household falls into that category. So you need to know that. You obviously wouldn't normally know about the health status of people who live with your employees. But in this case, that's important information for you to understand. Similarly, you have clinically vulnerable individuals who have got health conditions themselves that mean that they probably don't need to shield, but they're going to need extra safeguards. And you're going to need to understand why and what kind of accommodations you're going to have to provide to those individuals to keep them safe if you're asking them to come back to work, or when you're deciding whether that's actually the right thing to do for those individuals at all. And finally, you have other vulnerable groups as well, and that's a really wide category. So other vulnerable groups includes people where you suspect that there might be domestic violence or neglect or mental health problems at home, significant financial troubles. Those kinds of things can make people vulnerable. And again, not necessarily information that you normally formally collect, but it's really important that you have it so that you can make the right decisions about what to do when you're releasing lockdown, who it's important should come back into the office, who it's more sensible for them to stay at home for longer, who, let's say it's not an office, it could be a physical environment, like a warehouse, what kinds of accommodations you need to put in place. And in order to make that assessment, you need to have a lot of information about individuals and you need to know what to do about it. And to build on John's point, you're going to need to make sure that you have documented all of this really carefully and really clearly. And part of the reason for that, and this goes back to the 44% of you who said you're worried about people feeling like they're safe to come back to work. This is a time when unsafe employees may use data protection legislation to help them understand what you're doing and in the context of a dispute if they don't feel safe. And they have the right to ask for copies of the DPIAs that you do. They have the right to ask for copies of how you made decisions about them, about how they should be returned to work, about what safeguards were going to be in place. So it's really important that when you're writing those, you have one eye on the fact that this is part of the communications potentially that you should be giving to your employees so that they feel safe. And often those are the kinds of the data protection impact assessments in particular are the kinds of things that organisations write for themselves. But this time around, I would say it's really important to think about how you can use that to build a communication plan for your employees to make them feel safer. And thinking about this extra information that you're collecting, you need to think really carefully about how long are you going to keep that? Why are you going to keep it? How are you going to keep it safe because this is dangerous stuff, right? It's not stuff that you'd normally have. And it's a challenge, particularly when you're collecting it now, specifically to take people back to work, in a context where we've had the European Data Protection Board saying that this information should really only be kept for as long as the pandemic is running. But the pandemic may never completely go away. So how are you going to strike that balance between finding, keeping this data, but only keeping it for the minimum amount of time? And a way you could think about that is to tying it into the government's threat levels, but it's really important that you consider that. And just to give you a very quick example of why it matters, that you can explain your thinking really clearly. We had a £50,000 fine recently, or €50,000 fine recently, and part of the reason why that fine was what it was that when the Data Protection Authority in question went in to talk about why the organisation had made the decisions the way that it had, they couldn't provide them with anything explaining it clearly. They could only provide them with examples of the kinds of things they take into account and not a proper risk assessment framework. So again, it's really important to be able to show that you've got a really structured approach to making these decisions, structured approach to what data you want, how long you're going to keep it for, how are you going to use that to make your employees feel safe at work and make sure that they're right to feel safe.
Okay, fantastic. So I think we've probably come up with a lot of reasons, actually, a lot of risks that are going to happen as a result of coming back. And as a result of the change in working environments. And of course, just drawing on Camilla's point for a second there, obviously all of this additional data that we're holding, should you be breached, just increases the risk of even more severe fines and the risk of even more penalty than before. So very, very important. Okay, so if we move on to our second question, and before that we'll have our second poll. And I'll launch this poll now, and it's a simple question really, which is what do you think the future will be like for your organisation? 3 simple answers. So if we can do a quick 30 seconds on this one. Wow, that's already really interesting. Okay, I'll count that one down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and close. And there we go. So hopefully you can see the poll results. We can see there very clearly that very few of us think we're going to go back to the way that we were. So things are definitely changing. And half of us think we'll never go back to the way things were, which is actually astounding and not unexpected, I guess. But you know, we've changed massively over the past few weeks, and the 42% of us think that we're going to go through cycles of lockdown and release and lockdown and release, and I think that's very likely too, and probably for a period of a year or two at least. So yes, very, very interesting. Okay, so if I hide those now, we'll go back to the presentation. We can come on to our next question. And now we talked before about the risks, and now we want to think about very carefully about the actions that both privacy and information security teams need to take to manage compliance through this transition phase from the way that we were to the way that we're going to be. And this time, I think, if it's okay, Geraint, if you can start us off on this one, what actions would you take from a security perspective?
Well, I think, as this sort of poll indicated, potentially we're not going to be going back to exactly the way that we were beforehand. So this means actually we've got another transition from the state we're in at the moment, the lockdown, to a new state, which means we're going to have to actually plan what that will actually be, what that actually look like. So I want to first of all discuss about keeping employees informed about the threats that they actually face. So we've had an increase in sort of COVID-19 related laws. That's going to continue. You've got to educate people about that, and you actually need to make sure the education is actually relevant to the current threats they are facing. So it's important to make sure that you keep them up to date with all the threats that they need to be aware of, and make it relevant and keep it sort of fresh with actually what the current ones are. But don't forget, people do actually put the older threats in every now and then just because they catch somebody out because they've forgotten about it. So you've got to keep that relevant. As we go forward, we go to the new states of operation, which could be a mixture, a hybrid of sort of working from home and working in the office, maybe with reduced facilities in the office. One doesn't know yet what that might look like. You've got to make sure you've got your plan for that and actually do the assessment to actually see what the risks will be in that environment, and sort of keep detailed documentation around how you're going to actually move forwards. And this would be particularly useful if you've got to go through several cycles of actually going back into lockdown and then back into sort of a more relaxed environment. If you've got planned it correctly and you've got the documentation, it just makes it easier to switch between the sets of documentation as you sort of go forward. You also need to make sure you keep track of where your data is, especially if you're going through cycles of actually moving people out of the office and moving them back in. Where is the data, how they're accessing it, what devices it's been accessed on. So it's actually a question of actually tracking or having an inventory of the information, where it is, who has access to it, and making sure they're actually sort of, you know where your data is at all times. You also need to actually do your baseline. In information security, we talk about baselines. Well, our baseline's changed quite a lot over the last sort of few months, and it's going to change again. So we're going to have to sort of continually do baselines, look for what the new normal is, and then look and investigate the unusual activity beyond that sort of baseline. And that's going to be a continuous process, and companies are going to have to sort of baseline their environments more often to actually understand what is the current situation and what is unusual. So I think that sort of covers what I want to say.
Fantastic, thank you, Garen. Camilla, can you pick up on that next?
Sure. Yeah, I think Garen's exactly right. We're going to be constantly changing. We're going to have to be constantly looking at what normal means at the moment and how is that about to change. And for those of us who were expecting that lockdown is going to ease and tighten and we're going to go through cycles of it, that's particularly interesting because you can expect that those decisions will happen quite quickly, actually, and they can be quite localized. So if you watched Boris Johnson when he did his first announcement about how they were going to start easing the lockdown, you may remember that he said that they wanted to have the flexibility to do it on the basis of areas, towns and villages, which means that you may not be used to having many different regulatory and rule environments for your business, but you could find that an establishment, an office, a shop in one town actually has got different rules and different things to comply with than something in a different town, and that you can't have everybody applying by the same policy anymore. So you're going to need to be able to build a lot of flexibility into the policy. Differently from that, we've got the 8% who say that they're waiting to go back to normal, which means that probably you're expecting that your existing policies are going to be fine again soon. So you need to make a decision about whether you're happy to just act outside those policies for a brief period of time, or whether you're actually going to have to do something to manage the risks that are not being controlled the way they normally would be. But either way, you still need to be responding to it and really thinking about whether your policies are helping you make decisions right now, and whether they're working for you well, and whether, you know, if it turns out not to be like you think, and you do end up having to make changes, what kinds of things will you have to do? When you're expecting lockdown to tighten and ease, it can also be useful to have thought through what those scenarios might look like. So you can see that actually the guidance the government's giving is quite simple and quite similar a lot of the time. It's just that they're allowing things happen slightly more. So the 2 meters guidance becomes a bit more important as people are allowed out in public a bit more. So you can actually start to plan for what your environments might look like and start running some tests and start thinking through how your processes might change, particularly if things could be different in one office to another, and see what what differences those make. And while you're doing that, it's really important, I think, to think not just about what the processes are themselves, how are you going to get the job done, but also what oversight and what management reporting and are you putting in place. Do the things that you would normally put together, do they do the job that you need them to do? Do you need to put something else together so you can really see emerging risks, emerging trends, things that you're going to need to jump on and fix quickly? Are there any things specific to transition? So if you look at the guidance that the government's given out, for example, as part of the social distancing measures, they've recommended that you stop using electronic tags to let people into offices and that you open up more doors. And they've recommended that you put a human security guard onto those doors and have people show them a pass from a distance. That gives you really, really different information about who's in your premises and really different set of risks about how you make sure that you're only allowing authorised people in, and different risks for the, you probably wouldn't usually have that number of security guards guarding all of those doors either. So how are you going to manage all of that? How will that change over time? They're all quite thorny little problems and quite detailed, and it's quite easy to think in a high level at the moment, but it's actually the devil's going to be in the detail, and the detail is going to be where all the changes take place. And for that reason, the thing that I would recommend the most of all, and it's the most dull thing, but to keep on top of your documentation, write this stuff down. As you're changing from one way to another way, if you don't keep on top of writing down what you're doing, writing down the baselines that Geraint was talking about, writing down the way that you're doing it, what are the contact details for people, how are they changing as people are in work and out of work, and all of those different things. If you don't keep on top of that, it could get quite muddled quite quickly. So I think that's quite important to stay on top of. That's me, Peter. Okay,
brilliant. And John?
I think picking up on the 51% that think we're not going to get back to normal, and I'm inclined to be in that camp myself. The new normal, we're getting guidelines from the government, we're getting guidelines from authorities, from the ICO, from other statutory authorities around how they're going to be a little bit more understanding, etc. But they're guidelines. The legislation's not changed. There's no change in the legislation that says because you've got a security guard on the door and if you have a data breach, then, well, we'll understand that because we suggested that in the first place. The guidelines haven't changed. We've got to be as tight now as everything around protecting people's personal data, whether we're working from home, whether we're working back in the office, whether we're transitioning. So it's so important, as Camilla just said, to document everything so that if we do have a data breach, you've got a timeline of what it is that you've done, so that when it comes to reporting, if it becomes a reportable breach, then you can show the ICO what steps you've taken. You can say to the ICO, yes, we had this, we had a security guard on the door, this happened, or we had, we changed our policies for home working. The next question, the question always comes from a data breach. What training had the person had who was implemented in the data breach? Well, if your training hasn't changed from when they're in the office to when they're home working, you're leaving yourself wide open to that there. So it is so important, the timelines, and again, I've had this with DSARs this week. We spoke last time on the panel discussion around DSARs that were pre the lockdown and people trying to defend themselves for not complying because they hadn't, because of the lockdown, when in actual fact they should have completed it long before that. It is so important now during the lockdown that everything is documented. And bear in mind that that documentation could become public. So when I say public, under a DSAR, or again under an FOIA, if you're subject to FOIAs. So my piece on here for managing compliance is treat it exactly the same as you would do now. Your processors are going to have to make sure that they've got it, and if you are a processor, your controllers that you're working for are going to need to know that you are looking after that data the same way. Make sure your training is updated, that you're not using outmoded and outdated training methods for people whose working environment has changed, that they know that if they've got the right equipment, they need to know if they need to cross-cut, if they need to cross-shred things, as opposed to just shredding them. Make sure that everything that goes into protecting the personal data within your office relates to where your workers are now, and be prepared to justify that in the event of a breach or a subject access request.
I think it's a good point you make in relation to processes as well, and it may be time actually to go back and re-ask those questions to the processes that you should have asked already over the last couple of years about what they're doing and how they're adapting and changing with COVID-19 too. Okay.
I think there's just one more point that I want to bring out in the training actually, which is I think it's really common for us to go into organisations and see that actually most of the training that people get is pretty standard, and it doesn't really help them relate what they're being asked to know about to what they're being asked to do. And this is a really good opportunity to get to grips with that actually, and to make sure that people understand clearly what it is that you're asking them to do and what you can learn from the process of teaching them that way. It's not common to see organisations get that really well.
Okay, very good point. So, question number 3, but before that, poll number 3. Okay, I saw a few of you had issues answering the polls. Can I just remind you that you answer the polls in the panel on the right-hand side. There is a drop-down for polls, and I'm just going to make this one live. Okay, and you can answer the poll in the panel on the right-hand side if it's on the right-hand side of your screen. And this time we're just asking, really, which of these is the closest to your experience of adapting to the pandemic? So, how's it been for you?
We have a problem with the poll that I've just noticed. We have the last 2 answers are the same, and that's not what it should be. So when you're answering,
so if you can answer it as it is on the screen.
No, you can't answer it as it is on the screen because the last 2 answers are the same. So,
right,
if
so
you
the
could
last
treat
answer should be.
Answer as, yeah, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, the last answer should be, we found it difficult to begin with, but got there in the end.
No.
No, so the middle answer is the one that's wrong, which is we found it difficult to begin with, but we got, oh no, they're both the same.
I'm right. So, more questions. The answers should be, I'm terribly sorry, this is the joys of live technology. So the answer should be the top one. We planned well, we adapted quickly. The middle one, we found it difficult to begin with, but we got there in the end. And the last one should be, we found it very difficult, and I don't think we've coped very well. So if you can go from the top to the bottom when you're answering it, and treat the first one as being really confident, very proud of ourselves, and the bottom one as being actually, this has been a struggle for us. That would be fantastic, and we'll interpret the results like that. But thank you for bearing with us.
Yes, thank you, Camilla. I can see we've still got a couple of people who are having challenges actually getting their answers in. Apologies for that. It should be as part of the GoToWebinar panel that you have on the right-hand side of your screen, or which is where it defaults to anyway. If you can't see that, then God help you. Okay. All right, so we'll wrap that up now. Perhaps not quite so successful, that one, due to our answers. But yes, I think it's fairly clear. Let's have a look and see. I'm going to close it now and share the result we had. Obviously, as Camilla was saying, the bottom answer was not the one that's listed, but 50% planned well and adapted quickly, which is fantastic, I think, actually, bearing in mind the suddenness with which we all had to change. And a further 40% feel that they've they've got there. Is that right, Camilla? Is that the right answer for the middle?
That's right, yeah.
Yep. So a further 40%. So 90% of the people that responded now feel that they have, in one way or another, adapted to the current situation, which I think just goes to show how adaptable we all are as a species, if nothing else. So fantastic. So let's hide that and crack on with the questions. And the next question is, what have we learned from this lockdown, and how should these learnings change the way that we behave in the future? And this time I'm going to start our questions with Camilla. And Camilla, what do you think the key learnings have been?
Yeah, so I'm really encouraged by saying that 50% of people felt that they managed to adapt to this quickly. And I've definitely, in general, been incredibly heartened by the amount of innovation that I think we've seen from a lot of organisations who changed and adapted really quickly to what must be one of the biggest challenges that businesses ever faced. It's been amazing to see. And I think one of the things that the businesses that don't feel that way may feel is that actually the policies haven't necessarily helped. The planning that they've done wasn't quite right. And I think one of the lessons that we're going to learn is about the need to make sure that when we're doing those things as organisations, we need to be thinking about how they help us to respond and be resilient quickly in unexpected situations. And for that, one of my personal favourite things to talk about with clients is the importance of making sure that your policies make it really easy for people to make decisions. So they are setting out a method, criteria, rather than specific things to do. They're setting out a thought process that's right for your organisation. So when something needs to change, it's really clear about what's important when you're making that change. Privacy by design is the other thing that I think is really important. As a privacy professional, I've obviously been reading a lot about the sorts of challenges that have come up from people trying to implement new technology. And I'm sure we're all quite familiar with what's happened to Zoom, which I think has been the most high profile, that an enormous number of organisations and people privately have used Zoom. But it's a Chinese company, and it hadn't really been built with a European view of privacy in mind at all. And because of their exponential growth, which is difficult for an organisation to cope with on its own, they've also had to do that at the same time as, on a pretty nearly daily basis, security researchers have been coming up with new privacy failings and problems that they've had to fix technically. And they are being investigated by data protection regulators all over the world now as well. So these are huge problems. And that's problems for Zoom, it's problems for anybody who's been creating a rolling technology that's suddenly being used on a much larger scale and more quickly. But I think for the organisations who are trying to do that as well, I think it's quite clear that if organisations are getting this wrong, then you're making it so much more difficult to confidently make those changes. So I think one of the things that I'm expecting to be a lesson learned is actually that those sorts of considerations of how can you safely and properly use technology, has it been built with your organisation's needs in mind? Can you flex and adapt it easily? I think that's going to go up the procurement agenda in ways that it hasn't so far. And the last point that I wanted to make, I've kind of already made it, that kind of sheep training approach is really not enough. Because it leaves people not understanding what their personal role is when they do their job in managing the risks that the organisation faces. And it leaves them not really understanding how the organisation wants them to make decisions. And I would like to think that one of the lessons that we're going to learn is in organisations where they've found difficulties in making decisions, even when they were only right at the beginning, and you've got around it, I'm hoping that you're going to learn and debrief about what it was that made those things difficult and what kinds of things that you would have been able to do, how you could have trained people differently, how you could have planned differently to help make those decisions and make those adaptations more easily. So that's what I'm expecting to see as the lessons learned.
Brilliant. Okay, John, what are the lessons you think we should learn with a legal perspective?
I think the main thing that I would across is that this wasn't the doomsday scenario I think that we all thought it was going to be. As Camilla rightly said, the innovation and the adaptability that people did was great. And in some cases, it was actually mind-blowing what people thought of and how they did it. The downside is now translating what they did into policy, because we're in the here and now, we're going forward into post-lockdown perhaps, and then we may have to come back out of it again. So from the legal side, as we put on there, the focus on the why, not the what. I think this is making people look at why are we doing this? Goes right back to the very beginning when we said about, when Camilla mentioned about collecting health data. Why are we collecting this data? Not what we're collecting, why are we collecting it? What are we going to do with it? How are we going to keep it secure? Don't forget to debrief. Look at the things that you've done now. Look at the policies, revisit things. Get help on there. Look at it and say, right, what can we learn from that? Privacy design by design is something that we harp on about all the time. You've got to make sure that what you're doing now is acceptable, and when you move forward, when you come out of lockdown, to make sure that you've got the right policies in place again there. So the documentation side, I keep harping on. It is so important to do timelines to make sure that your policies change and that you learn from those policies. Long rambling policies that tell you what it is that you're going to collect, but don't tell you why you're collecting it and what you're going to do with it. If in doubt, take advice. Look at your DPIAs. Be prepared to defend your decisions. That's what I would say. The decisions you make now, as I said at the beginning, when we come out of lockdown, and the ICO and the other statutory authorities look at the decisions that you've made in the cold light of day, especially if you're fighting an employment tribunal as well, because you've furloughed somebody, or you haven't furloughed somebody, or you've made somebody redundant, or whatever, let somebody go because of this. All of those DPIAs, all of the decisions that you made, all of those policies are going to be brought into question, either with the ET, subsequently via subject access request. So learn from what we've done, I would say. Look at what we've had, one eye behind you and the other eye going forward. Learn from it.
Fantastic. And Garrett.
Okay, I'll just sort of start off by saying, in sort of business continuity terms, as you come out of lockdown, you can be returning back to what's known as business as usual. But as we already discussed, business as usual is not necessarily what it was before the actual lockdown started. There's been a lot of innovation around the way people are working, and what people have realised is those innovative ways actually work for their company. So they don't need to actually go back to the old ways. They can actually take advantage of the innovation and actually move their business on. And that requires that everything needs to be brought up to actually support that. The documentation that's been talked about, it's got to support that. Your planning has got to actually support that. One of the great things I think that's actually been seen is the fact that people have actually managed to adapt their plans to actually manage the actual lockdown. I know many companies would have thought about a pandemic before this as being maybe we'd lose 10–15% of our workforce to an illness. I doubt very many have actually thought the government will actually shut the country down and make everyone work from home. But even with that different outcome, companies have managed. Their existing plans, they took them, they modified them, they made new plans and implemented them. So the planning is important, the documentation is important. We've just got to make sure that we take into account all the risks that potentially come with innovation. Quite often innovation comes around and people innovate without thinking about security as being sort of part of the sort of the principles behind it. So we've got to make sure that this innovation is actually secure going forwards, and it's important that the security teams actually do that.
Okay. Fantastic. And I mean, I certainly think while it's important to realise that so many businesses have done so well in changing and adapting. Obviously, what we've also got to remember is that an awful lot of businesses out there have struggled and still will continue to struggle until they can return to the way that they need to work. So there's still more change to come, I think, from an awful lot of businesses who haven't yet been able to do that. Okay, so what we'll do now is field any questions that have been provided by the audience. I can see we've got a couple there to begin with. And the first one I think is going to go back to you, Geraint, actually, because it's what, if any, additional technical controls would you recommend around home working that businesses might not have considered before? Right. Tricky one to spring on you.
It is actually quite a tricky one to answer without sort of a context to sort of go with it. What controls have been put in place, etc. But to me, it's actually around ensuring that the endpoints are secure. Previously, many people have actually worked inside a business and they're inside a secure perimeter. So it's the technical controls to make sure the endpoint is actually secure, the individual devices, so that the host-based firewalls are actually updated and are actually got the correct rules in there. You're no longer relying on there. It's about actually adapting your enterprise security to actually work on the endpoint and making sure that those controls are in place.
Okay, brilliant. And the next one I'm going to aim at Camilla, and I know you're going to laugh, right? Because when it says, do you see GRC as a business necessity post-COVID?
Governance, risk and compliance.
Yeah. And then it says, generally viewed as nuisance and extra cost. How to best position GRC moving forwards?
Right. I think that's a really valid thing to say. I think, and I think it's actually something that's been ingrained into compliance people quite often as well, that you're a cost centre and not a value driver. And we kind of know it's not true, but you kind of get conditioned to think that way. If you look at some of the things that compliance makes organisations do, and the difference between organisations that have done them wholeheartedly and those that have done them in a box-ticking way, the outcomes are really different for what has happened between those organisations in this pandemic. So if you look at something as simple as your records of processing, right, which sounds like the most dull thing that data protection legislation makes you do, just write down all of your processing and the stuff about it and keep it in a great big list. Boring. But if you've done a really good job of that, what you've actually got is a set of documentation that tells you what is going to happen when something changes. So you have all of the knock-on consequences right there in front of you in a really useful list, and all of the things that you're going to need to do. So you know which systems are going to be impacted. If it's going to be a data processor, you've got the contact details are right there. Supporting documentation ought to be linked ideally as well. So it makes it much, much easier, much faster to figure out your what the consequences are going to be. And one of the projects that I worked on towards the end of last year was mapping processes for a large organisation, and just getting the boundaries to line up was one of the biggest challenges. Every output from one process needed a matching input to another process, and it just didn't naturally fall from the process mapping workshops we were doing. You can imagine if that's the case in this case, a regulated industry, that I was actually expecting, and I would expect that anywhere, that most organisations have a view of part of it, but not all of it. But your records of processing and how you fix that. And you can see that those sorts of things are things where compliance just suddenly completely comes into its own for making sure that you have the information that you need at hand, up to date, fixing your risk, keeping things safe, so that your management team can focus on the things that they need to be focusing on, which is coming up with creative ideas for innovation, knowing it's safe, knowing that nothing's going to come and bite them. And it does that. So yes, my answer is I do think governance, risk and compliance is going to be incredibly important after this, but I think it's going to be most obviously so in the organisation already taking GRC quite seriously.
Yeah. I mean, certainly from our experience before, those teams, those GRC teams who have built the necessary information resource they need to be able to do their job properly, suddenly become hugely valuable to the organisation for innovation and creativity, because that centralised resource of what data was where was never there before, and so it's a first port of call, not a last. So I agree entirely with that.
Same with the data protection impact assessment. So if you've done a data protection impact assessment well, with a whole heart, not just a box tick, on a process, then you have all of the information all in one place and the consequences of everything that you've done. And it just would not happen without GRC.
Okay, we've got another. Sorry,
Peter, I was going to say, just closing on that, I think anybody, probably the entire audience here who are involved in the GRC world or data privacy world, we're never the most popular people in any organisation. You know, we're not always top of everybody's Christmas card list, etc. And I think going forward, where people are going to have to make those risk decisions as to whether it's important or whether keeping the business afloat is important, I think this is where, as Camilla said, if we get it right now, then going forward, when we do come out of this, and we keep saying this, it's going to become really, really important. It's so important that we, as privacy professionals, keep that momentum going and let the board know what it is that we're doing and how we're going to address that in the future.
Very much so. Right, we've got only a couple of minutes, but I'm just going to ask one more question. I'm going to pose it to you all. So whoever wants to answer it first, please do so. And it's a tricky one. It's where GRC and InfoSec have themselves been furloughed. What balance do you strike between looking at what was done in your absence versus securing the here and now when returning from furlough? Where do you go first? Do you look back at what's been done, or do you just work on now?
I think you have to look at what's been done in your absence. Because that is going to guide the way that you're going forward. I know that may seem like a bit of a stock answer, but you need to know what's been done whilst you've been away, so you can prepare yourself for what's coming next and what's coming as a result of what happened whilst you're away. And that probably proves my point that we're not the most popular people when it comes down to business.
Not popular, but very necessary and actually very important.
Exactly.
There you go.
The challenge from my point of view is that if you don't look backwards, you're probably never going to get around to it. And that's how you end up in a situation where you've got a data breach going on for years. Right? So that's the danger. But I'd actually reframe the question and say, rather than thinking about what's already happened and what's happening now, I'd look at the criticality of the processes. So I'd be looking at, is this processing high risk data or large volumes of data? Is this a business critical process where your business will collapse, right? Regardless of whether work's happened on that in the past and the future, start there. And then eventually you'll get to other things, but that would be the thing that would be most important for me. Yep. Really making sure that I always understand those really high risk, high importance processes properly, how they are right now because of what's happened in the past.
Fantastic. So I think what we're going to do now is not answer the remaining couple of questions because we've only got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to start to wrap us up. And to do that, I mean, I would just like to take the opportunity really just to mention that, as I said at the beginning, I mean, GRC International, very fortunate organisation to have a blend of skills, feedback is always very available, privacy, security, compliance, and legal support. And we're now offering a blended service where you can access all 3 of these skills. You know, we're going to send you copies of the presentation and so on with contact details, but please contact us if you think we can help. I'm just going to leave us with really a big thank you to my panelists for today. They've been fantastic. A big thank you to you, audience, because you've sent us in some challenging and some very interesting questions and taken part in our polls. And I thank you for your time today. And please do contact us if we can help in the future. And most importantly, I hope you all stay safe and well. We'll see you next time. Thank you.